Welcome to another Incentives and Perspectives video. So today what we're going to talk about is why college and certain degrees, right, are becoming less and less useful. And we're going to examine it in a couple different lights. So useful in the sense of, getting a job, useful in the sense of actually wanting to learn things, and also why, just in general, the education system, you could include like law school, we'll talk about medical school system, right, is becoming more about jumping through hoops than like checking off a lot of boxes that are just required than actually learning anything. And I think I'm going to try to draw some parallels just in your head between like the US government, which you can think of as very inefficient, and how it has a lot of these requirements that you have to do that aren't necessarily connected to what you need to know. And I'll explain kind of a lot of the thoughts. So one of the big parts is our argument, right? So we'll start off with just like college in general, right? Is how college started, right? And why it was like designed to be 4 years. I don't have exact information of like why exactly it started. I just know that it's been around for a very long time. And then in the beginning, they weren't very rigorous on certain academic standards, right? So you're talking about early days of Harvard. It's pretty much if you're just white, rich, and you submit something, you get in, right? But what we've been noticing in the past couple of years is that there's been this like exponential increase in the difficulty of the applications, and the competitiveness of applicants, right, to get into these top schools. And so let's try to understand why do people want to go to college so bad, right? And also like why these top universities, right? So the whole idea is not about college, right? It's like there's actually nothing about college. The reason they want the college is because they want this idea of a future, right? Of a stable, guaranteed, high income job, right? That's pretty much the idea of going to college. So they're saying that if you don't go to college, you are not going to get this stable, guaranteed, high income job, or the chance of that becomes very, very small, right? So in a sense, you're kind of like hedging, right? You're thinking about if life itself is some sort of risk, and you're saying, hey, by going to college, right, and having that, I can now hedge, right? I can now say, well, even if things don't go well, I have my college degree to fall back on, right? And that's supposed to be as opposed to not having a degree to fall back on. So right away, I want to say that like I agree with going to college in a lot of situations. I think the thing I don't agree with more is actually how people use their time at college. But I think that the problem is when you make a blanket statement to everybody, right? I don't think that it's correct. You can't say that everybody should be going to college, because I strongly disagree with the fact that you should apply that to everybody, because each person is different, and there are people for who this schooling system doesn't work, and that doesn't mean that they're a failure. That doesn't mean that they have some issues. If anything, they probably are smarter than other people because they have different ways of thinking, which is something that's not valued anymore in society. Okay, so if we go back to this, right? So this is the whole idea, and you have to understand why, if you think about it, if you're my age, if you're mid-20s, something, right? Your parents are the ones telling you to go to college. And why are they telling you to go to college, right? Why are they not telling you to do something else? Well, it's because for them, right, back in like the maybe like, you could have a range of parents, but let's say like 60s or so, right? Or even before then, right, 19 like hundreds from their parents, right? What they see is that, okay, higher wage jobs, right, are kind of gatekept behind this requirement of education, right? So if you give someone your education, if you get some education, you have a ticket to go get this higher wage job. Whereas other kind of jobs, right, if you don't have it, well, tough luck, right? And so that's all very well and good, right? But there's like developing problems with that currently, because things have changed, right? And I'm not saying they haven't changed. So like college can also kind of guarantee you position, let's say, in here we go. Whoa. Okay. A position in what we can call higher society. So there is a delineation between people who have college degrees and do not have college degrees. And obviously you could split that into like those who have high school diplomas and those who don't, right? And it's typically, I'm not saying this is correct, but I'm just saying this is how it is. It's typically regarded that people with college degrees are in a different echelon than people without them, right? And then you could even go to the extremes of this and say people with PhDs are then above these people with college degrees, and you could say the same thing about JDs, MDs, right? So you have this kind of, you have this stratosphere of kind of educational attainment. And in a sense, that leads to a stratosphere of the society, right? And the idea is that the PhD should be very smart. They should make them a lot of money. And same thing with the MD, the doctor, right? The JD, the lawyer. But those who don't have college degrees or who have only college degrees should make less. So they're saying it should be in this direction of you're going up in educational attainment, you're spending more and more time to do a certain task, right? In the sense of you're getting trained at these universities. And the more you get trained, the idea is the more valuable you are, the smarter you are, and that should contribute and lead you to be able to get better jobs that pay more. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, let's go back to look at the assumption. Sorry, the screen's frozen. Okay. Let's look at the assumptions that our parents made, right? Or people's parents made in general. So they're saying higher wage jobs and education. This was at a time when there's definitely some sort of boom, right? And I'm not saying there's not a boom now, but I'm saying this has caveats. And it was typically in a lot of STEM-like fields. If you think about coding back then, it became really hot during internet skills, right? That was a big thing. Now you can think about like AI, even stuff like engineering, right? This applied, right? Because engineering is a kind of complicated, skilled thing. Even science, right? This kind of medicine, right? They would always have higher wages. So the kind of problem now is that if we use the example, let's say gold, right? Why is gold valuable? Gold is valuable not because you can eat it, not because, you can sleep on it and it'll keep you warm or something. It's valuable because it's rare. And it has like a time, validated over thousands of years store of value. And it's because it's rare, scarce, and valuable, and people like it for jewelry and etc., right? So the problem is what happens when everybody starts getting college degrees, right? So you notice in the beginning, so this is something I want to point out, is like when there's a strategy, and this is the same thing with investing, right? When there's a certain strategy that comes into play, as long as that strategy is not like, as long as that strategy doesn't rely on like who you are as a person kind of thing, but if it's a more generalizable strategy that you could apply to anybody, right? So in investing, you could say, oh, if you just do this one strategy, right, you'll make a bunch of money. But the problem is that's not true, because what happens is then everybody would copy that strategy if it actually worked, and then eventually it wouldn't work anymore, right? And that's what we can kind of apply to college here, because it's like, okay, that was true for, let's say, the first 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people. But then you get to a point where now you're at this like situation where a lot of people have college degrees, right? And then what happens is that doesn't become a distinguishing factor now. Now the assumption is everybody has a degree, right? And so now what are the job systems doing? They're always doing what they've been made to do, which is filter out differences and supposedly find higher quality talent. But the point is, it's like the companies do not get bigger. They have the same slots, right? So if you think about it, what before going to college was going to be a golden ticket, right, towards like actually getting a job, because the fact is going to college was difficult, hard, and scarce, and that was kind of your golden ticket towards getting a stable future, and that's why parents wanted you to do that, because that's what they saw in their lifetime when they went to college, right? But now it's like everybody has college degrees, so now it's actually not about going to college, it's about which kind of college, right? And this would explain right, why we see so much intense like tooth and nail competition just for the top couple schools, right? Because I want to point out, like, even if you're a very mediocre, not good student, you can still go to college, right? Even if you fail probably some classes, you can still go to community college and transfer, and you'll still go to college, right? But a lot of people are realizing that the best jobs and things that they want, right, typically, and I put this in air quotes, typically are associated with a higher ranking like university. So now what we've done is we've kind of changed the landscape. Instead of going to college is going to guarantee you a good education, good future. Now it's like you have to go to a good college, because now going to college is no longer the discernment factor, right? If everybody can go to college, right, that no longer becomes a thing. If everybody has gold, it's no longer valuable, right? And so this is where you get to the point of things like Ivy League, and the idea is that, oh, the people that get into here, because it's so selective, are supposed to be smart. supposed to be. And the reason why I question that is for a lot of different reasons, but I'm going to point out two large phenomena, right? So one is the rise of athletics in college. And I don't have any issues with, let's say, like prominent normal sports in the sense of like football, baseball, I don't know, just like basketball, those kind of sports, right? Those are okay, American sports. It makes sense. Okay, maybe that you want to have a college team, that's fine. But the question gets to when you start getting down to these really highly niche sports, right? And then you look back in history as to why colleges are not necessarily very objective, and then there becomes a problem because objectiveness obviously is very is not really possible in extent, but there are levels to it. So if you were to argue that you only did your applications, your admissions based off of test scores, right? And there's a whole issue with people saying that like, well, prepping for the SAT is no longer like the SAT itself is no longer a good indicator because you can just pay for prep and then eventually you'll do better. I will personally say that's probably true, but there's still people who pay for prep and do terrible on it. So it's not like gonna fix everybody. It's not like, I think some people imagine like, oh, if you have money, then you can automatically get a 1600. Like, no, that's not how it works, right? It makes it easier, yeah, but it is not a guarantee, right? So it's not a direct way. And if you were smart and you were able to figure things out, you would still have a chance of getting a high score for sure. Like that's something you is definitely able to do, right? But the point is, if you're to do it, let's say I create a new test, okay? We say throughout the SAT, I create a new test, and I make that test super objective. It tests like just the thing you're supposed to know. It's really hard, and I just take whoever scores the best on that test, and I put them in my college, right? Well, the problem with that is it's too objective, and unfortunately, for a lot of people who, let's say, are running these colleges and these institutions and have a lot of influence on the admission system, right? What would probably happen is you would have a very different racial distribution in the college. And it's very hard to determine exactly what that would be, but you could say that maybe there wouldn't be as many white people, actually. I know sometimes you would think that there would be a lot of white people, but the evidence shows in situations like Caltech and stuff, actually, there could be a huge proportion of Asians because and of course, this is a big generalization, but the point is, like, whichever culture, and this is generalization, right? You can still have individuals who do really well in it, but whichever culture is, let's say, preparing people a lot for a lot of knowledge-based tests, right? You would probably see a disproportionate amount of them in the college and accepted in. And what would happen? Well, then, like, let's say, like, somebody else all of a sudden starts deciding to, like, maybe, like, let's say, instead of all Chinese people getting in, now like later on you start having smarter people, right? And they're from a different race. Then that would actually completely change the racial composition of the school because we are saying we're completely objective. We're fully just about like your score. If you meet the score cutoff, you get in. That's it, right? And then based off of that, that's just how we run the school. And you would see what happens is there would be huge shifts all the time, I think, in who actually is in, right? Because it's just based off of raw intellect. But what do we see? We actually see that from year to year, in almost all colleges, the racial distribution is about the same. And so if we kind of ask, like, how is that possible? Well, I want to ask you guys a question of why are a lot of these top schools, why do they have these extremely niche sports as college sports? If you go to the more general state schools, they may or may not have, some of these really, really niche sports. Like, I'm not going to name drop them because I don't think it's like very helpful or appropriate, but if you imagine a sport like underwater basket weaving, that is, you could think of that like as, I'm not using it as an actual example, but I'm just saying when you get so narrow to the point where if I asked the average person if they knew that was a sport, they would say no, right? Or I asked the average person, they would say, I don't know what that is, right? And then you see that these top schools have multiple teams and multiple of these kinds of sports, right? Then we get to a point where you start to wonder why exactly is the university adding these kinds of sports? What benefit is happening, right? If we imagine who has the power in a university, right? It's kind of the people who donate a lot, right? The people who are put in charge to watch over that money, and the people who are in charge have to appease the donors in an indirect way. And they want to continue to get more donations, right? So they're going to try to appease both sides of the situation. So they're going to try to appease to maybe diversity. They're also going to try to appease to anti-diversity as well, depending on who is donating, right? If you get a huge grant from somebody and all they say is, I just want to make sure you guys keep having, keep giving, let's say, white people a chance or something, or keep giving like black people a chance. You don't think that's going to influence them? Like, it's definitely going to influence them, but they would never say it, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that like a lot of these really niche sports have high barriers to entry because they're very niche, and usually just like tennis, right? It costs a bunch of money to just even play and to get really good training. I think this is a situation where you can kind of just pay to win, in a sense. If you get a lot of training, as long as the kid works decently hard, right, they can kind of just get in, right? So now what we see is like, okay, that's a way to sort of game the system. And I mean, this is somebody with personal experience in water polo, who went through kind of that recruiting process and saw how like athletics is a wide open back door to the college compared to the front door, which is being just, obliterated by like hundreds of thousands, not maybe not hundreds, but like tens of thousands of applicants, right? So then you start to ask, okay, then like if I told you that if college was completely objective, the racial composition would like yo-yo a bunch probably, right? Then like, why is it, and like I tell you this thing about the athletics and these niche sports and how they're probably just solidifying like a lot of white individuals into the school in a roundabout way. How can we kind of trust this kind of system to be objective in other ways, right? If we already see that in multiple instances it's kind of not necessarily being completely objective, right? That would make us skeptical, because that means that the people running this institution are, in a sense, have different incentives, or focus on different things from what the purpose, quote unquote, of college is to be. So let's get into that, right? Let's get into the purpose, right? So the purpose is like, okay, there's two purposes that we can talk about, right? One of them is like, one of them is, let's say, learning and curiosity, right? And the other is get a job, right? And we're going to focus on the technical side of get a job, right? Technical skills. So let's kind of explore why, for majority of people, college can fail at both of these two things, okay? So the problem is when you get into college, right, if you want to really focus on learning and curiosity and have this very romantic idea of college as like the place where you expand your mind, you talk to other people, you have debates, like I agree some of that's true, but the presence of this second part really undermines the first part, okay? Especially when you're coming out of, you have to understand, these people just finished high school, right? And what was high school like? High school was like a race to get into college, right? Because they know how it's competitive, right? And in a sense, when you're doing things to get into a college, you are doing them in a very transactional way. So if you think about learning curiosity, right, what is this based off? This needs passion. This needs like personal interest in something, right? Otherwise, if you don't have passion, personal interest in a certain subject, right, you're not going to have any curiosity. You're not going to care. And so if you could just come out of a situation that could be like equated to a pressure cooker, and you come out of your high school, in your high school everybody was fighting just to get that top spot, because again the acceptance rate to a place like Stanford is like 2%, right? And you try to get into college, right? You finally get into college, but you had to do, let's say, all these weird activities because you're trying to, pretty much application max yourself, right? You're trying to do enough of the really impressive stuff, enough of the different things, so that way when you write your essay, it all comes together in a really good way that makes you stand out. And so it's like gaming the system pretty much, right? So you're trying to find the mix of different things that are important enough but well-rounded enough to make you seem like the ideal person for the school, so you can get in to these top schools, right? And your parents, especially if you're wealthier, are more likely going to be paying money to find somebody to help you game the system, right? Through doing certain activities, through writing things in a certain way, and then that will guarantee you your way in. And then as a result of that, right, the idea is that you would then be able to have job security, and that's why parents get so involved in this process. It's not like it was before, right, when 50, 60 years ago you just put your name on a piece of paper, send it in, say you'd like to go, and you just go, because at that time most people are not even thinking about college, right? So now we're in a completely different ballpark, right? We're in a situation where everybody realizes that now it's not about getting to college, but it's actually about getting into, let's say, the more difficult top schools, okay? So you just come out of this pressure cooker situation, right? And are you really, and now like you're being told, so if you think about this, right, your parents are putting enormous pressure on you because you know that to appease them, you have to get a stable job that pays well, right? And then if you're doing that, then there's typically not a question of what do you actually want, right? What do you actually want to learn? What do you actually want to do? Because typically you're going to apply as a certain major, and you may or not, you may switch your major or not, and then try to switch it back to something because that would increase your admission chances. So you just see like everything's just trying to game the system, right? So in that, right, there's no opportunity for your passion, personal interest to really come out. And the point I'm making here is like there are obviously exceptions to this, right? But this is going to be for the vast majority of people, because as soon as you get into college, all of a sudden you think that you made it, right? But then you realize, wait a second, now you got to get a job, right? And technically you are a leg up if you're at an elite university, right? But you still actually do need to struggle a little bit. And so now your energy is now focused on getting a job. And so as a result of this, right, the college was supposed to do two things, right? Develop learning curiosity and help you get a job. But the fact that the getting a job has outweighed everything else, and the fact that a lot of parents are very concerned about their kid being, independent and being able to support themselves, and they place that above everything else. And this is the fact that if everybody, if you ask any parent this, I know what they would say, right? If you ask them, hey, would you rather your child be bored out of their mind working a 9 to 5, and it doesn't have to be a 9 to 5, but just working a job, right, that pays them comfortably well, that they can afford rent, they can afford everything, they don't need to worry about stuff, but they're just so bored out of their mind? Or would you have it be, oh, they really love what they do, but they're like, making minimum wage, and, they struggle sometimes, and sometimes, you have to send them some money, right? Every parent's going to pick the first option, and therefore their whole mindset, their whole approach, their whole kind of painting. So what they do is they paint the landscape for the kid. They tell them, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, right? And then, so their whole painting of the landscape is kind of imposing that reality on their children, right? Who are going to high school and then realizing, hey, if passion, curiosity, that doesn't matter. What matters is my future. What matters is my job. What matters is being able to support myself. That matters more than anything. And so now we see how this second, like this other priority that the college is supposed to provide actually just eats up the other one. And so this is why when you go into college, right, for the vast majority of the time, there's no learning or curiosity, right? Like, people are there to just check boxes, right? And you can see this with like people who, let's say, like try to finish college early or do other things, right? And the reason they finish early is because they just want to get the degree and get done with it, right? It's not because they're there to actually like, oh, I'm really curious about this one subject, I want to take more classes. No, they're just like, give me the degree so I can go get a job, right? And then I can get started, and then I'll be done, right? So that's like really the mindset we're seeing a lot. And I think that's one thing that, so, okay, actually, yeah, before we get into that, but like, so I think if we're clear on this, then let's go on to the other side of get a job, right? So college is supposed to help you get a job. The problem with this is, who are the teachers? Professors, right? So when's the last time the professor worked a job at a company? For most people, it's never. They were in academia, they went to college, they did research, they did more academia, and they did all this stuff. So what are they really good at? They're really good at research, they're really good at academia, they're really good at complicated stuff, right? Now, does this translate into real world skills? No, most of the time not, right? It could, but most of the time not. And so now what we're seeing, especially with stuff like computer science, is that like the actual skills you learn at school are likely dwarfed from what you could have learned online. But the problem is that if you learn stuff online, they're like originally, right, there's no way to check that, right? They're like, well, you say you know it, but like, how do you actually know it? But now the problem is with CS, right, it's so technical that you're actually able to do that. And you have these stories of individuals who learn everything online, and just because they have the skills are able to get the job. And then the fact that this exists and that it's still uncommon, but it's like, at least it's happening. The fact that these major firms like Google are hiring people based off of just raw talent, raw skill, really puts the question of going to college in question, because like, again, this is not applicable to everything, but it's like, if you went there to try to learn everything, but then what happens is, I see this again and again, and as well as like in econ and stuff, you have people who go take classes because they need the classes to get their degree, right? Because they need to apply with a degree that's at least relevant to what they want to do, right? You can't be applying as a computer science major with like a philosophy degree, right? For like a job, I'm saying. Like if you want to apply as like a computer science person for this job, right? You can't be philosophy because they'd be like, you have no skills, right? So you take these classes to like fulfill your requirements, and then they give you grades because they need some way to rank you, right? But I don't think that most jobs, right, are really checking the grades that much. I mean, I could be wrong, but at least, I think there's a difference between getting A's and F's, right? But I think like as long as you're doing like decently, like okay, like you were saying C's and B's and stuff, like they're not going to be like, oh, you're, because the problem is like each school has different situation, different metric. You could have taken an easier class. They have no idea, and honestly, I don't think they care, right? What do they focus on? They're focused on execution, right? The business people of running the company are not going to hire somebody who just looks like really good on a resume. They actually want to see some execution, right? For the most part. Of course, this varies among other situations because if you have a less technical place, they may actually just value wherever you went to school and not really check anything else. What we're talking about in the example of a very technical computer science like job. So then you're like, okay, I'm relying on these professors who haven't actually been in the industry, right, to teach me things that I need for this job, right? But then what you see is that, oh, the stuff they're teaching me is either too complex, not relevant, or outdated, right? And then what am I going to do? Well, this is why you have stuff like Leak Code, right? Leak Code is like I don't know too much about it, but I'm pretty sure some sort of like online like interview practice for like computer science. What they have is OAs, which are like online assessments, which are pretty much like quizzes and tests to ensure that you actually know what you're talking about in terms of like computer science, right? And so if you think about it, the fact that there is an OA just shows that they don't care where you went to school. They don't care. I mean, they care a little bit, but they don't care like, like they care more about your skill, right? So now it's just, I think it's like when you have a crack in this idea of college as the thing that gets you a job, because now what do you see? Because like I said, right, jobs have the same number of people they need to hire, but now everybody has a college degree, right? So then you can filter based off of like, okay, let's say better colleges, worse colleges, but the fact that you have a college degree is not going to give you any leg up in the job market. And that's why we're seeing now that in the job market it's getting really tough because it's hard to discern people. It's hard to separate them because they all have college degrees, right? They all have these like activities and things that they did, but it doesn't necessarily always translate into actual skill. And then that's why they're doing a really heavy focus on skill. And that's why you could have, let's say, an impressive degree from a certain university, but if you don't pass the OA, which is the first part, the first screen, right? If you don't pass that, you don't pass a coding interview, they're not going to take you. Versus somebody else, right, where they may actually just weight the actual coding interview part like heavier. So there's a lot of exceptions to what I just said, but I think that we need to focus on this, like the fact that this exists, the fact that there exists somebody who has been hired without, going to college, and like that just really puts whole cracks in the system. You can think about like, I think Palantir has like a different high school like internship program, and from what I understand is like now what matters a lot more is if you have an internship. And if you get an internship and you get a return offer, that's like all that matters, right? And to be honest, what dictates that is more interviews stuff than actual, let's say, like college degree stuff. I mean, they still try to limit you just because they want to do it batched by ages, right? So they don't want to have too many people apply all at once because that'd be too much. So they try to separate you by your college year. But you can see that there's very big cracks in this because if you can have a majority of people still go to college and then struggle to get a job, right, then it really puts into question, why is everybody going to college, right? Now, of course, if you're doing, like, let's say medicine, you have to, right? You don't have a choice. And even for some of these other stuff, you may have to, right? But for something that's so technical that where the company itself recognizes that they actually value the technical, like, expertise more than, let's say, this college checkbox, right? Then it's actually changing a lot of stuff. And I think that something I think about, too, is always this idea of like, just like the US government, right? When stuff doesn't change over long periods of time, that doesn't mean the system still works. That means that nobody has had the fortitude or kind of collective will to change it and update the system because of how complicated, how like weird that would be, how like they would have to change everything. So they just leave it. So the question is, why is college 4 years? And does it still need to be 4 years? You have people in high school who are now taking, because college becomes so competitive, they're now taking community college classes in high school. They're taking AP classes, which are supposed to be college level courses, right? And now everybody is doing that. So the point I'm trying to make here is it's not about knowledge because they're learning all the knowledge. You can learn all the knowledge you want online, right? And in fact, a lot of these people are learning, like myself included, have learned the knowledge already, right, in high school, because it was so competitive that we had to already know this stuff, so that way we would be more impressive for the applications. So then if you think about this, what do we have? We have high school, we learn something, right, like biology, right? Then we go to college, and you get taught the same amount of biology, right? Yes, you can go a little bit deeper, but the fact that there's even redundancy there is like a waste of money, right? Because like, why do you need, but you still need to do that because you need to finish your biology requirement to apply to medical school. And a lot of medical schools don't like you using, let's say, other kinds of credits because it seems weird, right? So now you're at a situation where we are doing things not for reasons, but because it exists in this format, in this structure, right? Like, why is medical school 4 years, right? There's actually some people who are changing that, who are making it 3. And the fact that that can change signals that there's a lot of redundancy going on. And I think the problem with that is that when there's redundancy, right, well, what are we wasting? We're wasting the youthful years of the entirety of the nation, right, in doing things that don't really like matter, right? I would argue a lot of people aren't really learning anything from school, right? They're just continuing, and they're not really like, paying attention to stuff. They're not really stimulated with their learning or curiosity. Yeah, there's a couple people, but we're talking about the majority, right? Because majority of people are just like, let's get to the job, let's get to the job, let's get to the job, let's get to the job. Because they're being pushed by their parents, right? Because their parents are like, I'm going to pay for your school or whatever, but you got to get a job, right? You got to support yourself. You got to support. So it's like, there's no independent thought going on. There's no choice to do anything else. And to be honest, I think that this current system, right, I think in the past, the incentive would be like, hey, go to the best kind of school and stuff, which I think it still is. But if you're not going to go to the best school, I would say try to, let's say, use as much of your high school knowledge and stuff, and try to just skip as much college as you can and just get your degree as soon as possible, and then get on to the job, aspect, which is what some people are doing, right? A lot of other universities, they take more credit. And it's really interesting how the top universities refuse to take other credit, because they act like, oh, what you've learned in high school is not the same. What you've learned in, like those community colleges is not the same as here. Well, from personal experience, I'll say it's definitely not the same, because the people who teach it here are much, much worse. The people who taught in high school were way better, and they actually had more time to explain to me. Because now I have a research professor who doesn't even want to teach, but they have to because the university makes them. And so they're dictating my grades and stuff, and I'm out here trying to maximize my grades just because that matters for no apparent reason, right? Like, once you get into medicine, there are minimum bars for things that once you meet them, there's no advantage to exceeding them. When you certify your boards, right, or pass your boards, nobody asks you how much above the threshold did you pass, right? So I really think that going forward, this discontentment with the separation of college graduates, right, and the lack of their success is going to lead us in a different direction. It's going to lead us towards a different emphasis, hopefully a different process in kind of the job system. But I think it's definitely going to take a while. And I think that it's going to be interesting how the legacy institutions, right, of these like universities, how they rationalize and create a reason for them still to exist. Because if you think about it, it's an extremely profitable and in their eyes, very important kind of part. But we now see that, also this is the other thing I want to point out. In the day of your parents, right, there is no internet. So the information is literally in textbooks, and you do need somebody to break that down. But now, with like YouTube and all this sorts of stuff, you can get very high quality explanations for things. In a sense, I would say, and I would say this with very strong confidence, that you get better explanations than those who are at the universities, right? So all these things kind of point in one direction, and they point in one direction of the realization that most of modern society is you jumping through hoops for no reason, right? Because if you, let's say, don't actually know any of this stuff and you need to learn it, that's fine, right? I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm saying for the individuals who can learn on their own, who are very motivated to learn, which I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, right? They're forced to waste their time, waste their precious years doing something again and again that doesn't really matter. And they have to repeat learning the same thing over and over again, and just wasting their attention in these kind of weird cycles for years and years, and it makes no sense. And I think that's why we may see in the future a disillusionment with the current system, because people are realizing that there is no longer a golden ticket. There is no longer like security, right? There is no longer like stability. There is no longer this idea, if you do this, then that, right? Because now, like, for example, some of those firms that are very technical based, right? They want you to do and be able to do actual physical things and make physical things and know physical things. And I would argue that somebody could learn a lot of that on their own. But the question is, when will those companies just decide to hold open tests, right? Like, why wouldn't you just say, okay, you know what? For the interview, we're having an online kind of proctored test where you're going to have to just fill out this test, and we're going to see how you do, and the people who score the best are going to be the most knowledgeable, and we're just going to accept them, right? Because how would that shift things? Let's just imagine, right? That would shift things towards all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, the actual knowledge is the important part. Not the like degree that says you should have knowledge, but the actual knowledge itself. And I'm guarantee you would have a much higher quality output. Because the problem now is that you can have a lot of people who actually don't really know anything after they finish university. And the reason is because you go through all these kind of, requirements and things, but like I said, the professors don't know what job you're actually going to get, right? They're not tailored towards that. They're not trying to teach you specific knowledge or information for that. And as a result, you just get like a random bits of knowledge, but whatever you do for your actual job, you're probably just going to still have to learn on the job. Then you're like, what was the point of that then, right? Like, oh yeah, maybe it gave you a foundation, but couldn't you get a foundation elsewhere, right? And so like, I think that the whole momentum is really changing, and it may take a while for it to shift and people to wake up and realize, but in that there's opportunity, right? If you can find firms and things that are very talent heavy and focused, right? And they just want that, and you want to just get experience, right? Go ahead. If you want to, let's say, game the system by, just speed running college, so that way you can get in early to these kind of things and have more time to kind of try to, get a job, go ahead. And there's even another option is if you're smart and you think that this is all too easy, then you should use the extra time while you're still, unfortunately, spinning circles in school and waiting until your time is up. You should use that other time to do something productive and challenge yourself. And you have to put it on yourself to do that, because unfortunately, right, if you just go through the motions, you will have wasted a lot of your most precious years, and you won't have much to show for it. Because I think that the narrative is changing, right? The narrative is always changing. And so you have to just be aware of how it's changing and use your own reasoning in your own situation to understand that. And realize that for a lot of people, their parents are not going to understand because of the fact that most people in general are not very open to other ideas, just in general, but like your parents will also probably not understand because like they have gone through a period of time where this was the most, coveted kind of thing to have some sort of degree like that. And this is a very common fallacy when we see, oh, if I did something in one situation that worked, therefore it must work in all situations. And that is not a correct extrapolation. You cannot make that assumption because situations change, especially if you're talking about a period, maybe 40, 50 years ago, right? Or, even 30, 20, 30 years ago. The landscape is always shifting, and you have to adapt, and you have to use your kind of own mind to understand how is the game shifting, how is this kind of situation shifting, and how can I come out on top of that.